The first thing I saw when the taxi slowed down was a sold sign planted straight into our front yard, right where my wife used to grow tulips every spring. It wasn't leaning, wasn't crooked, it stood there confident, as if it had every legal right to be there. My hand tightened around the handle of my suitcase, and for a second I honestly thought I might be dizzy from the flight. You don't expect to come home from a vacation and see your life labeled with one word. I paid the driver and stood there longer than I should have, staring at the house like it might blink first. The porch light was still the soft yellow I installed myself, the one Lenora said made the place feel safe at night. The wind chimes were still hanging, clicking quietly, counting time like they always did. Everything looked familiar, and yet nothing felt like it belonged to us anymore. Lenora stood beside me, adjusting her cardigan, calm in that way she gets when she's thinking hard. I wasn't calm. My chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped tape around my ribs and kept pulling. I walked up to the door, pulled out my keys, and felt my stomach drop when none of them fit. The lock was new, shiny, unapologetic. I knocked once, gently, then harder, because knocking softly suddenly felt foolish. When the door opened, it wasn't a stranger standing there. It was our daughter, Meredith, holding a mug like she'd just been enjoying a quiet afternoon. She didn't look surprised. That was the part that hurt first. She looked past me, at Lenora, then back at me, and sighed the way parents usually do when their children disappoint them. "Dad," she said, "you should have called first." I remember thinking how strange it was to be told that at my own front door. Somewhere behind her, I heard her husband's voice, low and irritated, asking who it was. Meredith didn't invite us in. She didn't step aside. She just stood there, blocking the doorway like a gatekeeper. And that's when I felt it. Not confusion anymore, not shock, but the first sharp cut of something deliberate. I glanced at Lenora, expecting fear, anger, something. Instead, she gave me the smallest nod, the kind she used to give me before bad news at the doctor's office. That was when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a decision. Behind Meredith, a cardboard box slid across the hallway floor, filled with photo frames and loose papers I recognized. And in that moment, standing on my own porch with my keys useless in my palm, I understood that whatever explanation was coming next was going to change how I saw my own child forever. The house was still there, but the welcome was gone. Meredith finally stepped aside, not to welcome us in, but like someone moving furniture they'd already decided didn't belong there anymore. The hallway smelled different, sharp and artificial, like one of those sprays meant to erase real life. I caught myself wondering who thought our house needed erasing. I dragged my suitcase inside and immediately clipped my shin on a low table that had never been there before, which felt almost poetic. Even the furniture was new and already attacking me. Lenora followed quietly, setting her bag down with care, like she was afraid the floor might accuse her of trespassing. I tried to make a joke, something about how at least the house was still standing, but it came out wrong, thin and tired. Humor has rules, and this moment didn't want to follow any of them. My daughter didn't laugh anyway. She was already walking ahead, leading us to the living room like a real estate agent finishing a tour. That's when I noticed what was missing. The photo wall. 40 years of birthdays, holidays, bad haircuts, and cheap frames, gone. In its place hung a large abstract painting I'd never seen, all sharp lines and cold colors. I stared at it longer than necessary, trying to understand how a house could forget us so fast. My chest tightened again, slower this time, like something settling in. Her husband, Blake, was sitting on the couch scrolling his phone, legs crossed, shoes still on. He looked up, nodded once, then went back to the screen. That nod carried more weight than words. It was the nod of a man who believes paperwork has already done the talking for him. I stood there, hands awkward at my sides, unsure where to put myself in a room I'd paid taxes on for decades. "Where are our things?" I asked, and my voice surprised me by staying steady. Meredith gestured toward the hallway. "Packed. Mostly." Mostly is a dangerous word when it's applied to your life. I walked over to one of the boxes and opened it. Inside were old bills, a broken lamp, and a stack of instruction manuals I'd kept for no good reason except habit. It felt like being handed the leftovers of my own existence. I bent down to pick up a framed photo that had slipped out, then groaned louder than necessary as my knees protested. "Well," I muttered, rubbing my leg. "At least my joints still recognize this place." Lenora shot me a look that said stop joking, but I saw the corner of her mouth twitch. Even she wasn't immune to the absurdity of it all. That's when Meredith cleared her throat. She folded her arms, the way she used to when she was 12 and thought confidence could be manufactured by posture alone. Mom, Dad, we need to talk. Those words usually mean trouble, but the tone she used meant something else. Finality. Preparation. Like a doctor rehearsing bad news they've already accepted. Blake finally put his phone down and stood up, stretching like he had all the time in the world. Let's just say it plainly, he said. The house has been sold. Sold. Such a small word for something that felt like being pushed out of your own skin. I looked at Lenora again, waiting for the storm I expected. Instead, she adjusted her purse strap, calm as ever, and nodded slowly, as if she'd just heard the weather forecast. And that calm scared me far more than anger ever could. Because Lenora only gets that quiet when she already knows something the rest of us don't. For a few seconds after Blake said the house had been sold, no one spoke, and the silence felt heavier than shouting ever could. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the same old sound it always made, loyal to a home that apparently wasn't ours anymore. My brain did something strange then. It started checking details instead of feelings, like a clerk counting coins after a robbery. Sold meant paperwork. Sold meant signatures. Sold meant someone thought we were already finished. I asked when, and Meredith answered too quickly. While you were away. Her eyes slid to the window, not to me. That was new. She used to meet my stare even when she lied about broken lamps and missed curfews. Now she spoke like someone reciting instructions they'd memorized but never understood. Blake filled in the gaps, explaining interest rates, deadlines, pressure, words that sounded important but empty, like reading the back of a pill bottle when the pain's already there. I wandered toward the kitchen without asking permission, because my legs suddenly needed something to do. The counter was spotless, almost sterile, and my old coffee mug was gone. In its place sat a sleek machine with buttons I didn't recognize. I pressed one by accident and nearly jumped when it hissed like an angry cat. Well, I muttered, stepping back. At least the appliances are still fighting me. Some things never change. No one laughed, but Lenora let out a small breath that might have been one. Meredith followed me, arms still folded, explaining how Blake's debts had piled up, how they were drowning, how this was the only way. I listened, nodding like a man watching a foreign movie without subtitles. I kept thinking about the mortgage I'd paid off early, about the nights I worked overtime so this kitchen could stay warm. It felt surreal hearing our sacrifices described as available assets. I asked her how she managed to sell a house that wasn't legally hers. That question finally cracked something. Blake stiffened, Meredith's face flushed, and she said my name in that warning tone she'd used as a teenager. Dad, don't make this harder than it has to be. Harder. As if this were already the easy version. I leaned against the counter, misjudged the distance, and bumped my hip hard enough to swear under my breath. H has a sense of timing like bad comedy. Careful, Blake said flatly, not moving. You don't want to get hurt. The words landed wrong. I wasn't sure if he meant physically, legally, or just emotionally inconvenient. That's when Meredith said it, almost gently. You can't stay here anymore. No anger, no apology, just a statement delivered like a schedule change. She gestured toward the boxes by the hall. You'll need to take what's yours and go. I looked at the pile of cardboard and tried to remember when my life had been reduced to whatever fit inside. I turned to Lenora again, expecting her to finally break, to argue, to cry, to remind them of every birthday cake and sleepless night. Instead, she adjusted her purse, the same calm motion as before, and met Meredith's eyes with something I couldn't read. Not sadness, not fear, something steadier. And that was when it hit me. This wasn't the moment Lenora was losing control. This was the moment she was letting them believe she had. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the boxes like they might rearrange themselves into something recognizable. Cardboard has a way of making everything look temporary, even when it's meant to be permanent. I bent down to lift one marked kitchen, underestimated its weight, and let out a grunt that betrayed both my pride and my lower back. Don't worry, I said, half to myself, half to the room. I've been practicing for this moment my whole life. Gravity and I have history. That earned me exactly nothing from Blake, but Lenora's eyes softened. Meredith kept talking, explaining timelines, deadlines, logistics, as if clarity could replace decency. She said the new owners would arrive in a few days, that everything was already finalized, that lawyers had been involved. I heard the word lawyer and felt a flicker of heat rise in my chest. Not rage, something sharper. Awareness. People don't hire lawyers unless they know what they're doing might be questioned. I asked for the documents. Not demanded, asked. Blake hesitated, then went to a drawer and pulled out a thin folder, the kind that pretends to be important by staying slim. He handed it to me without meeting my eyes. I flipped through pages filled with signatures that weren't mine, dates that skipped entire conversations, authority that assumed silence meant consent. My hands shook just enough to annoy me. I tried to sit, missed the edge of the chair, and had to steady myself like an amateur dancer. That's new, I muttered. Furniture used to wait for me. Meredith winced, finally, as if she'd just noticed I was aging in real time. For a moment, I thought that might stop her. It didn't. She said the words then, the ones that settle into your bones. You're homeless now. She didn't shout. She didn't sneer. She said it like a conclusion she'd reached alone and saw no reason to revisit. Blake nodded beside her, arms crossed, relieved someone else had said it first. I felt something inside me fold. Not break, just fold. Like a letter you keep rereading even though you know the ending. I looked at Lenora, ready to guide her out, already planning where we'd sleep, how I'd make it sound temporary. But she surprised me. She smiled. Not wide, not cruel. Just a small, contained smile that didn't belong to someone being evicted from her own life. She placed her hand on my arm, steady, grounding, and said nothing. That smile unsettled everyone in the room. Meredith's brows knit together, Blake shifted his weight, and for the first time since we arrived, I saw uncertainty flicker across their faces. They expected tears. They expected bargaining. They expected noise. What they got was quiet confidence, and it rattled them more than anger ever could. As I closed the folder and handed it back, I realized something important. They thought this story was already over. They thought age meant surrender, that calm meant defeat. Standing there with a box cutting into my palms and my wife smiling beside me, I understood how wrong they were. Because when Lenora smiles like that, it's never the end. It's the beginning of a lesson. We carried the boxes out one by one, not because Meredith told us to, but because staying any longer felt like letting them watch us shrink. The front door closed behind us with a sound I'd heard 1,000 times before, except this time it didn't mean privacy or rest. It meant exclusion. I set one box down on the porch and realized my hands were shaking, not from the weight, but from the effort of staying upright in a moment that wanted to bend me in half. A neighbor slowed his car as he passed, curiosity written all over his face, and I gave him a polite nod like this was just another Tuesday afternoon. Pride does strange things when it's wounded. It makes you polite when you want to scream. I tried to lift the second box, misjudged again, and had to pause, pretending to admire the clouds while my back argued with me. Take your time, Blake said from the doorway, voice tight, like patience was something he was lending us. I didn't answer. At my age, silence is sometimes the sharpest reply I have left. Lenora moved differently than I did. Unhurried, precise, like every step was measured against something deeper than the moment. She placed her purse on top of one box and adjusted the strap, still wearing that calm expression, and I suddenly felt embarrassed by how much noise my thoughts were making. I leaned close to her and whispered that I was sorry for the house, for our daughter, for not seeing this coming. She squeezed my hand once, firm, and whispered back, not yet. 2 words, steady as a railing. We reached the sidewalk with our small stack of belongings, and that was when it truly hit me. Decades reduced to cardboard, a suitcase, and whatever dignity we could carry without dropping. I glanced back at the house, at the windows that had watched me grow older, and felt something inside finally give way. Not collapse, release. A letting go of the idea that this was still home. Meredith stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself now, watching us like she wasn't sure what she'd just won. Blake hovered behind her, already on his phone again, probably solving the next problem before it arrived. I wanted to tell my daughter 100 things, about loyalty, about consequences, about how debts don't disappear when you move them onto someone else's back. Instead, I just nodded. That seemed to confuse her more than anger would have. As we walked away, my foot caught on a crack in the pavement, and I stumbled, catching myself with a graceless hop that would have made my younger self laugh. Still got it, I muttered, breathless. Lenora actually chuckled then, a soft sound that surprised me, and for a second the world felt less heavy. Humor doesn't fix betrayal, but it keeps it from owning you completely. We reached the corner and stopped. No plan, no destination, just the two of us and the late afternoon light stretching long across the street. I looked at Lenora again, really looked at her, and saw something new beneath that calm certainty, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. I didn't know where we were going yet, but I knew, with absolute clarity, that Lenora had already decided how this story was going to turn.
Raymond thinks I stayed calm because I was tired, or because age teaches you how to swallow shock without choking. The truth is simpler and sharper than that. I smiled because I finally saw the full picture, and once you see it, panic becomes a waste of energy. Standing on that sidewalk with our boxes, I wasn't homeless. I was done being underestimated. I watched my husband trying to look taller than his shoulders allowed, adjusting his grip on the box like it still answered to him. He hates when his body reminds him he's 64, especially in public, especially in front of people who already think they've won. I almost laughed when he tripped on the crack in the pavement, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly Raymond to pretend it was intentional. He's been bluffing gravity for years. We walked a block before he finally asked the question he'd been circling like a nervous dog. "Where do we go now?" His voice was quiet, careful, like he was afraid the answer might break him. I didn't answer right away. I wanted him to feel the pause, to understand that this wasn't improvisation. This was timing. I suggested a small motel near the highway, the one with the flickering sign and the lobby that always smells faintly of burnt coffee. Raymond grimaced but nodded, because pride can wait when exhaustion shows up. At the front desk, he dropped his wallet, his keys, and somehow a receipt from 2009 all at once, crouching to gather them while muttering about gravity again. The clerk pretended not to notice. People are kinder to older couples when they don't know the story. In the room, Raymond sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall like it might offer guidance. I unpacked our things neatly, lining them up as if order alone could reassure him. He asked me finally how I could smile back there, why I didn't say anything, why I didn't stop it. I sat beside him and took his hand, feeling the familiar roughness of a man who spent his life fixing things that weren't supposed to break. I told him Meredith hadn't sold her home. Not really. She'd sold what she thought was her home. There's a difference, and it matters more than people realize. Raymond looked at me then, confusion turning slowly into recognition, like a light warming up. I reminded him of a meeting we'd had years ago, a signature he barely remembered signing because he trusted me with the paperwork. He always has. He started to ask more questions, but I stopped him with a finger to his lips. "Not yet," I said again, smiling properly this time. Outside, a truck roared past, rattling the window, and Raymond jumped like it had personal intentions. I squeezed his hand and told him to rest. Tomorrow would be busy, because somewhere down the street, our daughter was celebrating a victory that didn't belong to her. And she had no idea how close she was to losing everything she thought she'd secured. Raymond slept badly that night, drifting in and out, muttering about keys that didn't fit and boxes that multiplied when he wasn't looking. I stayed awake, listening to the motel's ancient air conditioner wheeze like it deserved a pension, and planned each step the way I always do, quietly, thoroughly, without asking permission from fear. By morning, Raymond was already apologizing for snoring, even though he barely had. He's been apologizing for existing more than he should lately, and that needed to stop. Over breakfast from a paper bag, toast too dry, and coffee too weak, I finally laid things out. I reminded him of the trust agreement we'd set up years ago after his surgery, the one our lawyer insisted on just in case. Raymond squinted, chewing slowly, then nodded, memory catching up like an old friend. He joked that he thought it was just another one of my organized woman phases, and I told him those phases have saved us more than once. We drove to the bank next, Raymond gripping the steering wheel like it might escape. He missed the turn twice, blamed the sun, then blamed modern road signs, and finally blamed me for choosing a place with traffic. Inside, the teller greeted me by name, which made Raymond blink in surprise. It's funny how invisible preparation looks until it speaks. The documents were still there, untouched, exactly as they should be. I watched Raymond's posture change as he read, shoulders straightening, breath slowing. He didn't smile yet, but his hands stopped shaking. I explained what Meredith couldn't sell, what Blake never asked about, and why rushing paperwork leaves fingerprints all over mistakes. Raymond let out a low whistle and said, "Well, I'll be damned," like the phrase itself was stretching muscles he hadn't used in a while. We left the bank quieter than we entered, the good kind of quiet. In the car, Raymond tried to start it twice with the wrong key, then laughed at himself before frustration could take hold. "Guess I'm a little out of practice," he said, and for the first time since this began, I believed him in the best way. That afternoon, I made a call Meredith wasn't expecting. Not to yell, not to threaten, just to ask a simple question about a signature she assumed had power. There was a pause on the line, long enough for me to picture her face tightening. I told her we'd talk soon, and hung up before she could regain control of the conversation. Raymond asked if that was it, if things were already turning. I shook my head. "This is just the part where they realize they've been standing on thin ice," I said. He nodded, slow and thoughtful, like a man finally feeling solid ground under his feet again. And somewhere across town, our daughter was starting to sense that the ground beneath her celebration was beginning to crack. By the time the phone rang that evening, I'd already set the kettle on and lined up the papers on the motel desk like chess pieces. Raymond was pacing, pretending he was just stretching his legs, bumping into the chair every third pass like it kept sneaking up on him. "This place is smaller than it looks," he grumbled, rubbing his elbow. I told him the furniture wasn't the problem, his sense of direction just hadn't aged as gracefully as he had. The call was from Blake first, not Meredith, which told me everything I needed to know. His voice was careful now, stripped of confidence, asking questions instead of making statements. He wanted to know what I meant about the signature, about authority, about why the buyer's agent suddenly wasn't returning his calls. I let him talk, because people reveal more when they're nervous and uninterrupted. I explained, calmly, that selling a house requires more than urgency and assumptions. I mentioned the trust again, the dates, the clauses he'd never read because he'd been too busy drowning in his own mess. There was a pause so long I checked the kettle, then he exhaled sharply, like a man realizing he'd stepped off solid ground without noticing. Raymond listened from the bed, eyebrows climbing higher with every sentence, mouthing "Really?" like a delighted child. Meredith called next, her voice tight, controlled, trying to sound reasonable. She asked why the sale was being questioned, why the buyers were asking for delays, why the money hadn't cleared the way she'd expected. I told her the truth, not harshly, just precisely, and precision has a way of cutting deeper than shouting. I could almost hear her sitting down on the other end. Raymond tried to pour himself a cup of coffee during the call and missed the mug entirely, splashing the table instead. He froze, guilty, then shrugged. "Adds character," he whispered. I covered the receiver for a second and smiled at him, because even now, in the middle of this quiet storm, he was still trying to keep things light. When I finished the call, I told Meredith we'd be meeting with a lawyer in the morning. Not to argue, to clarify. That word unsettles people who've been relying on confusion. She didn't respond right away, and when she did, it wasn't anger I heard, it was fear trying to dress itself up as irritation. Raymond sat down beside me after, his movements slower but steadier, like his body had finally caught up with his resolve. He asked me if I felt bad, if any part of me regretted not stopping them sooner. I told him regret is for accidents, not choices. This wasn't an accident. Outside, the motel sign flickered again, stubborn and imperfect, still standing. Raymond watched it for a moment and said, "Funny how things don't fall apart just because someone expects them to." I squeezed his hand because he was right. And across town, the story our daughter thought she'd finished telling was beginning to be rewritten without her permission. The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and lemon cleaner, the kind of place that survives on patience and precedent. Raymond sat beside me, knees angled carefully, whispering that the chair felt lower than it looked and that gravity was clearly getting bolder with age. I told him to save his strength. Listening would do the work today. When the lawyer began laying out timelines and authority, I watched Raymond's face change, confusion giving way to a steadier focus, like a man finding the right pair of glasses after squinting too long. Meredith arrived late, alone, clutching her phone as if it could still rescue her. Blake didn't come, which told me he already understood the math. Meredith tried to explain herself with careful words, talking about intent and pressure, and doing what she thought was necessary. The lawyer listened politely, then asked one small question that landed like a dropped plate: who exactly granted her the power to sell? Silence answered before Meredith could. Raymond leaned forward to hear better, misjudged the distance, and bumped his knee again. He winced, then smiled thinly, as if to say, even my joints know this is important. The lawyer slid the documents across the table, pointing to dates Meredith had skipped and signatures she didn't have. It wasn't dramatic, it was methodical, and that's what made it devastating. Meredith's voice cracked when she realized the buyer's funds were frozen, the sale under review, the debts still hers. She asked me why I hadn't stopped her sooner. I told her I had trusted her, and trust isn't a leash you pull when someone starts running. Raymond cleared his throat, steady now, and said he loved her, but love doesn't turn wrong into right. She asked where that left her. The lawyer answered before we could, explaining consequences without raising his voice. Raymond reached for my hand, his grip sure, and I felt the quiet shift I'd been waiting for, the moment when truth stops wobbling. As we stood to leave, Raymond thanked the lawyer, and then thanked the chair for not collapsing beneath him, earning a reluctant smile from everyone in the room. In the hallway, Meredith called my name, softer than before, asking if there was anything she could do. I turned and told her there was: tell the truth, return what wasn't hers, and learn the difference between need and entitlement. Raymond squeezed my hand once more, and I knew he felt it too. Because the next step wasn't about proving a point anymore. It was about deciding how mercy would look after justice had its say. The house came back to us quietly, without applause or celebration, the way things often do when they were never truly gone. The sale was voided, the buyers were funded, and the debts that had tried to crawl onto our backs slid back to where they belonged. Raymond stood in the doorway when we returned, keys in hand, and tried the lock twice before realizing he was holding the wrong one, then laughed at himself like a man reclaiming more than just a building. Inside, the rooms felt smaller than memory but warmer than fear, and the wind chimes greeted us as if they'd been keeping watch. Raymond walked through each room slowly, touching the wall here, the counter there, nodding like he was greeting old friends who'd behaved badly in our absence. He made a joke about the couch being offended we ever left, then sat down too hard and grumbled about it taking revenge. I let him complain. Dignity doesn't require silence. Meredith came later, eyes tired, voice stripped of certainty, and for the first time she didn't ask for anything. She apologized without conditions, and that mattered. Raymond listened, said he loved her, and told her love doesn't mean protection from consequences, but it does leave room for learning. We didn't shout, and we didn't punish. We drew lines and stood behind them. That evening, Raymond cooked dinner like he always does when he needs to feel useful, burning the first pan and blaming the stove for changing personalities. We ate at our table, the one that's seen arguments, laughter, and now survival, and the food tasted better than it had any right to. Later, as the light faded, Raymond sat on the porch and said he felt older than yesterday, but lighter than he had in months. I sat beside him and told him age isn't what makes you weak, it's what teaches you when to stand. We didn't win by shouting or striking back. We won by knowing ourselves, by preparing quietly, by refusing to disappear when someone told us we were finished. The house settled around us that night, familiar and forgiving. And for the first time since this began, we slept not as people who had survived something, but as people who had kept their place in the world.